Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Broadcasts from Fiddler's Green. This is a weekly podcast that I do from my channel, The Distributist. So if you're here for the first time, I talk about politics, culture, and any type of topic that really comes up in the ordinary course of the week. Over the last two Tuesdays, I've had to rearrange and cancel some of these podcasts because of a variety of family issues. I wasn't able to make this particular time. But right now, I'm back and we're ready to do an ordinary podcast again. So thank you all for joining me. So for people unfamiliar with the format, I feel like I should announce this ahead of time. Typically, what I do is a little monologue and then follow it up with questions from the audience or super chats. And you can find the link to super chat me as an entropy link. It's an independent system that's not run by Google that I recommend using. And usually I try to make it an hour of both, although I usually go over by about half an hour in each segment. So it ends up being about 3 hours. But hopefully I'll keep it to the 2-hour limit today. So I'd like to talk I always like to lead in with current events because it's usually what most people are thinking about. It's usually what people have on their minds. They're trying to mull over what's happened. But over the last 2 weeks, there hasn't been a lot that has really happened. I'm thinking it's mainly having to do with the American midterm elections, which is one of the three major bumps of 2022 to 2023. The first major bump we're going to get is the bump that's coming with the November midterms, in which we get to figure out exactly how much of an anomaly 2020 was, and to what extent the Republicans can actually be an opposition party, or to what extent the Democrats are going to own full control over the government going into the winter. The next big bump is going to be the first frost in Europe and the continuing energy crisis. And I would argue that the next bump after that is going to be in spring of 2023, when we come out of winter and people realize that the supply chains are even more smashed than we thought, because a whole continent basically hasn't had enough energy to run their factories to capacity. Those three bumps are going to basically define what politics looks like in the next decade. And they're all ahead of us. No one knows really how to react to them, because anyone who says, I could probably throw in a fourth bump, and that is, perhaps, and this is still an open question, perhaps by summer of 2023, we will also know who the prospective winner is of the Russia-Ukraine war, which is another major destabilizing point of contention for the contemporary global American empire. But, with all these points, no one actually knows what's happening. No one knows what's going on. Everyone's just speculating. And because of that, we're sitting here really not having a lot to talk about. We're not really discussing new events. We're rehashing a reality that everyone's all too familiar with. We're rehashing the reality of constant inflation. We're rehashing the reality of an incompetent government that feels like it really likes mocking us. It's sort of funny how when I was a child in the 90s, the difference between Europe and America in terms of how people view their governments couldn't be more distinct in a lot of ways. In America, there were these two parties that were fighting a culture war. In Europe, the partisan division seemed a lot more subdued. It seemed like the two parties were more or less in league with each other. And the same thing in Canada, too. There wasn't any real culture war to speak of. There wasn't any real contention in politics. But at the same time, there was this impression that Europeans, and in particular, I'm really thinking of the Nordic European countries like Sweden and Scandinavia, they had figured everything out. And it was really us Anglo countries, in particular America, who needed to kind of get with the program, back on the good government's ideal of the FDR administration and the Great Society of Johnson. We needed to follow the Swedish model. Everyone was talking about the Swedish model in the 90s. And it took me a while to realize this, but no one talks about the Swedish model anymore. Does anyone remember that? What happened to the Swedish model? I don't hear about it anymore. I get the sense, and I don't know this from mainstream media, certainly, that things aren't going so well in Sweden. Otherwise, I'd probably be hearing more about the Swedish model. But no, we're not hearing about this. And additionally, it seems that politics everywhere have become more similar to each other. In America, it's become more like Europe in the sense that it's very, very obvious that we're existing inside the clutches of a single party. And in France and England, I think the culture war has gotten more distinct. The war between the elites and the populace has become more pointed. And I'm thinking the things that you just see here. I follow a few French accounts on Twitter. I won't say which ones, but I've noticed that a few of the more conservative Catholic French accounts have been posting really frequently about this recent murder of a young girl, Lola, in France. It was a horrific, torturous murder by this Algerian immigrant, and the complete inability and the complete unwillingness of the government to actually acknowledge that this death was essentially a giant hate crime against the native French. And this kind of reminded me of something that Morgoth talked a lot about the response to Bataclan, the Bataclan French terrorist attacks. And this was way back in 2015, right before I started my channel. A horrific terrorist attack that killed an enormous number of people, 129 people. And one of the things that Morgoth talks a lot about, and that that's kind of this tragic detail that's left out of our discussion of the Bataclan attacks, was that there were actually 130 deaths because one of the people who survived was so horribly depressed due to his experiences. And this was a terrorist attack where they basically just tortured people for like an hour before there was an intervention. He took his own life because he didn't want to, or he or she, I don't know which one, they didn't want to live with the memories, the horror. And what's so funny is at the same time that somebody is refusing, the only way that they have to process the horror is suicide. At the same time we have to deal with that reality, the government of France they went to extensive efforts to downplay the brutality of the Bataclan, just as they went to extensive efforts to downplay the brutality of the murder of this girl Lola a few weeks ago in France. And this sort of embodies this separation. The governments are afraid of their population developing a consciousness, developing an understanding of collective grief. That's the emotion that everyone's to express, and that's the emotion above all else that the governments want to destroy and tamp down. But you see this in France, this hardening division between the government and the population, moving into the mode and very much resembling the mode of the American culture war. And the same thing is true for England. There was this change of power in the British government, and I didn't think this would really, whenever you hear about British politics, as an American, your eyes kind of roll back in your skull. A lot of the content creators in this community are British. I think of Sargon, I think of Academic Agent, and they frequently do podcasts, and Morgoth too, I mentioned him previously. They frequently do podcasts and write articles about British politics, and this is just completely irrelevant. I mean, it feels like, okay, so I wonder what the State Department field offices, what shenanigans are they pulling off in Britain? Because it's very easy not to think of Britain as a real country, because it's even easier when you're a right winger, because you know well and good that the British government in many ways is a vassal state to the American State Department, and in many ways is being supervised by them. But I was surprised how, and I apologize for not muting quickly I have a little bit of a cough. It's very hard to mute dodge this, but I'll try. So halfway through this process, though, I started getting really interested in the emergence of this candidate, Rishi Sunak. What was so interesting is that, he's a conservative, and it was sort of like Kamala Harris. He was such a product. He was such a package that the elites just wanted to sell to us. Come hell or sell to us. I act like I'm British. I'm not British at all. Well, yeah, of course. Maybe I have like 5% British DNA. I don't know. I don't know. Does Irish count as that? Probably not. Obviously not. But this character was he was this creation of the cathedral, and everyone could see it. And there's this massive propaganda campaign, and they went through every other candidate before they got to him. And then one by one, from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss, they got rid of every single one other than Rishi Sunak. And just I think today or yesterday, he was declared to be the next prime minister of Britain. And of course, on the way in, he's all like, "Oh, I'm so British. I'm so British. So if you couldn't tell, Rishi Sunak is actually Hindu. So the pagan bros finally have their way. Great Britain has been liberated from the shackles of monotheism. Good job, golf clap. We've got a based pagan guy in 10 Downing Street. So, good job. I guess, maybe we won't cuck out to slave morality anymore. One can always hope. But on the way in, he was selling himself as the ultimate British person. And there's articles that ran, Rishi Sunak's cabinet, it's going to be the whitest, most British cabinet of all time. This guy's a conservative. Of course, he gets into office as prime minister, and what is it again? It's, I want to make Britain the most friendly place for the LGBTQ community. My first counselor appointment to the Home Secretary is going to be another South Asian. And a variety of noises about now we truly live in a multicultural society. Now we truly live in a pure multicultural society. This is their typical humiliation. We get it in America too. Just a few days ago, I think Joe Biden had this absolute joke. This trans influencer called Dylan come and have a conversation about trans rights. For those of you not aware, Dylan is almost a troll. It's this woman face trans personality that is popular on TikTok. But of course, as soon as you find a TikTok clown that's so ridiculous that they'd have to be a joke, what does our White House do? Well, because Joe Biden is the puppet of millennial progressives, they invite him over for an interview with the White House and give them official endorsement, because humiliation is the point. So, nothing is really. Is this so surprising that Rishi Sunak is now tugging? After the ruse of him being the most British person, the most British Indian person of all time. It turns out that deep down, what it means to be British is just to be an endorser of the global American empire's agenda. It's to embrace global homogenization of culture. It's to wipe away Little England and replace it with a modern multicultural state where there's no room for the distinctiveness of yesteryear. And of course, this is the absolute opposite of what the British people wanted. The British people very obviously had three concerns. The first one, maybe the more minor, maybe the most important, was immigration. You could argue that this drives the other two concerns. The British people have, obviously, as do most other Western people, do not want any more mass migration that radically changes demographics in their country. The second two things that the British people cared about were housing prices, driven by immigration to a large degree, and energy, which is driven by basically the global mismanagement of supply chains, which has a lot to do with the global mismanagement of geopolitics, especially in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war. And in all of these issues, Rishi Sunak is the exact opposite of what the people want. And yet he is the person who's occupying, was it number 10 Downing Street? That's at 10 Downing Street. He is the one who's occupying 10 Downing Street after everything is said and done. And this is something that I think you don't really get in America. Not the humiliation. I think you get a little more humiliation in America. But in America, there's less culture to humiliate. I say that, and I fully consider myself culturally American. But there isn't this sort of long-lasting, deep roots. When you're cutting down, when you're humiliating Americans culturally, or American whites in particular, because let's be honest, those are the main targets. I'm sure they'll eventually get around to humiliating American Hispanics and American Asians, but for right now, Gentile whites are their main targets. So let's be clear about that. But when you go in and you humiliate American whites, it's basically like cutting down a forest that was planted 100 years ago. It sucks. You're destroying the habitat of a variety of species, and that habitat will take a century to grow back, if it ever grows back. And in the meantime, there'll be an enormous amount of cultural destruction, a huge amount of loss of diversity, both biologically and culturally, depending on how you want to swing that analogy. And in the meantime, it's a bad deal. But when you go and you humiliate a country like Britain, it's like destroying an old growth forest that's been there for a millennia. These are trees that cannot grow back in any type of time frame that we can readily conceptualize. Just talking about the fallout from the energy crisis, this is something that I've heard Sargon and Academic Ancient talk a lot about. You can just go down the list of pubs. I mean, if you think about British culture, what do you think about? You think about the neighborhood pub. I lived as a child in Britain for about, a year. When I was about 8 years old, and even I was aware of the local pub. It was really weird because this was an institution that served alcoholic drinks. So, why would a person in 3rd or 4th grade know about the local pub? But the town I lived in was small enough so that I was actually aware of it in a way that I just wouldn't be aware of a similar institution had I lived in America. And I'm not, this is sort of an institution because you have pubs that are thousands of years old. You have, not thousands of years old, maybe like 800 years old. You have pubs that literally come down from the Middle Ages, where there's been a pub on that establishment for hundreds of years. And now, because of the energy crisis, they're going down, and they're not going to reopen because there's no path back to energy ever being cheap again. There's no path back to the pub ever being a necessary function of British life, because atomization is in full swing. Atomization is the order of the day. Once these pubs close, the first thing the British establishment is going to try to do is convince people that we don't need pubs, and pubs are a sign of regression, a regressive attitude. And so, just like that, a piece of old growth culture is destroyed, never to be returned. There's a great essay I wrote from Morgoth called Message to a Conquered People, the one that I wanted to kind of base this talk on, where he goes over the reality of what the Rishi Sunak, I want to say election, nomination, ascendancy, how do I describe this bureaucrat's ascension to power? Nothing seems right. He certainly was not elected. And he certainly does not have anything that would be a popular mandate. Not that I believe in popular mandates. But the election symbolizes a transition. It symbolizes a post-English Britain, to where there are no substantial industries outside of what the global American empire controls. And inside of that, what can actually be saved? What can actually be obtained? What can actually be preserved? When Morgoth closed the essay off, and it's a good essay, it's very much made me think because of my connections. I lived there for a year, so not deep connections, but my sympathy towards Britain and my kind of, I was there at sort of a critical time when you could see the old Britain, it was the 90s, right? Where you could see the old Britain still in the background, but the new Britain of the Spice Girls and New Labour, that was very much looming overhead. But at the end of the essay, Morgoth, he says to his readers, well, what do I really have to give you in terms of solutions? And he says, well, the only thing that I can give you, and I agree with him fully on this, the only thing I can give you is that I want you to kind of understand the situation you're in with both eyes open. We're a conquered people now. Our culture has been completely taken from us. We are a minority in our own homelands. At this stage, it's a fait accompli. And the paths back have all been blocked. And you have to react to this situation. You have to react to this state of affairs. And Morgoth also in his essay references this concept that I think he only mentions it in passing, but it really had me thinking, because this is something that I always, whenever I see people use this concept, and it comes from a particular crowd on the right. Usually, the people who love this term are either right-wing neo-pagans or they're university midwits who have read like one book in their entire lives, and that book is "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" by Nietzsche, and now they're here to explain to me, oh my God, did you know the difference between slave morality and master morality? And of course, this is the ultimate. I do want to steelman the neo-pagan position on this, but this is so thoroughly abused that it's really, really hard to. I've been to university. I've done my philosophy courses, and anyone who has discussed philosophy with philosophy majors will be well aware that this use of slave morality, progressives are comfortable with calling many of the things slave morality that the last things you would think of as slave morality, like, oh yeah, having a family is slave morality. Adherence to like monogamy is slave morality. Caring about your country is slave morality. I mean, the most prominent continuer or person who was influenced by Nietzsche in the last 60 years is hands down Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault considered sort of sexual degeneracy to be the absolute representation of slave morality. And I think it was later Jay Burden who mentioned this on a podcast. I really need to do a podcast with Jay Burden because he's done a lot of really good work. And he kind of reminded me about what the real point of this whole slave master morality was. And it was Nietzsche calling back to an extended discussion that was had by, I think it was Plato's Socratic Dialogues. I mean, it's been ages since I've read the Socratic Dialogues. I haven't read them since like undergraduate, so forgive me. But I do remember this, and correct me if I'm wrong, chat. But the idea was that slave and master morality are really more about disposition and attitude. The slave always sees himself in political conflict with the master. Whatever the master does absolutely defines him. The master does X, and the slave has to respond either to endorse X, to sort of be the house slave, or to rebel against it and be the rebellious slave, or the field slave, as Malcolm X would put it. And Susan, and this is Greek slavery, so I'm probably talking about Galatians, or later in the Roman example, I'd be talking about Greeks. So it's nothing to do with race. But what Plato was trying to call forward is that when masters act, they're just trying to make up their mind for themselves. They're coming to terms when they make a decision, or when they take a step forward, they're just deciding what their disposition is going to be to the universe. They can decide neutrally how to be without being forced into a political dialectic where they're constantly being forced to react to something that a larger political force is doing. The idea between slave morality and master morality, and I think this is what Nietzsche was getting at, because the way that I've seen sort of neo-pagans use it and sort of the undergraduate midwits use it is like slave morality is losers and master morality is winners. But I think how Socrates was using it and how Nietzsche was trying to invoke it was very much more along the lines of you could still lose with a master morality and you could still win with a slave morality. These were really much more things that were in the abstract. And so could a people keep a master morality? God, that sounds so cringe saying that. Could a conquered people not have a slave morality? Could a conquered people be independent? Could a conquered people be their own people? This was what really was implied by Morgoth's essay. And it really made me think a little bit about this and a little bit about the discussions we've had on the right recently. Now, I know that for the last few times I've talked about dialectics on the right, I've talked about people that the conversations I'm really tired of having on the right, and you'll probably hear a little bit about this again because sure enough, I can't keep my hand out of the cookie jar, and I can't stop getting into arguments with people that I really shouldn't be arguing with at all. But you can't help but feel that, and Morgoth, one of his hobby horses, one of his big fears, and I share this fear, this is what my last podcast was on, was his big fear was nostalgia. He's a big Spengler fan. He's read Spengler much more deeply than I have. And he is aware, as Spengler points out, that the mark of a moribund society is nostalgia. A mark of a moribund society is the culture that can't get its head out of the past. Ethno-narcissism is the danger, because ethno-narcissism is the sign of a dying society, and a society that can't possibly make anything generative anymore. And we experience that as the emotion nostalgia. You can see it in every single piece of millennial culture you consume. Remember the Star Wars? Remember when Ghostbusters was cool? Remember when Dungeons and Dragons was a thing back in the day? And no one's talking about the reality we live in or anything new, or what it actually means to live in the reality we are now. I mean, I see this too, even people who should know better, right? You have this whole thing with, especially in relationship to a lot of British politics, whenever British people get raked over the coals for the imperial past, they pull this weird flex where they're like, oh yeah, well, we beat you, losers. Yeah, great. And you're being colonized now. So if you go up to Ash Sarkar, for the Americans in the crowd, Ash Sharkar is this insufferable South Asian shitlib, although I think she calls herself a communist. I think she writes for The Guardian. But if you go up to Ash Sharkar and pull a flex on her for Winston Churchill, if I were her, I'd laugh at you. Because you're the conquered people now. You're the one dancing to the theme of the global American empire. And the global American empire needs to keep her group, her ethnicity, as a client class. And there's nothing they'd rather feed that client class than your perpetual humiliation. And every time you flex, you're participating in this whole slave morality dialectic. You're participating in the dialectic where you have to decide whether you're going to be on the side of the master or get the whip. And no matter what you do in this, you're going to play right into that dialectic. Whenever you go down this path of trying to flex on past imperialistic glory, because you were a conquered people. You are no longer determining your destiny. That's being determined for you. The thing that the British people need to decide, and I'm one to lecture them being an American with even less cultural firmament that we can glom onto than the Europeans. They need to decide what they can carry with them as a people who are downtrodden. And it's going to be basic things. It's going to be things that are close to the ground. The implication is, you should start a farm in the middle of the hinterlands. Believe me, if most of us could, we would. It's a question of finances. And if that prospect seems a little out of reach for us Americans, it's doubly out of reach for our friends in the British Isles, where land is at a premium and there isn't that much land to begin with. So, yeah, sure, we can fantasize about starting a farm and a homestead. But the most important things are the things that kind of stay close to you. There's so much, I think, that Americans could teach their European friends, their European counterparts, about faith in poetry and song. This is something that, whenever I look at British culture, I see a culture that is so rich, that is so deep, and there's a few places where they're lacking. I can't say it's poetry because their poets are better than ours, and their good poets are more recent than ours. Although I'm not so sure whether Philip Larkin And T.S. Eliot, I think actually Frost is, he's later than them. But certainly no one's writing good poetry right now, so probably it's six of one, half a dozen of the other. But the two aspects of the culture that always just seem completely absent from people who live in the British Isles, properly, I'm not talking about Ireland here, are religion and folk music, which always seems to be this huge gap in the British spirit. And it's always so surprising because they have these characters like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and J.R.R. Tolkien and T.S. Eliot, the very beating heart of the early 20th century poetic Christian revival is something that occurred at the heart of Britain, and yet that spirit's just nowhere to be found in the British people itself. I think it's because for so long people in Europe have had this exterior reality of culture that was buttressed up by the state itself. They didn't have to go to the deep takes. They didn't have to reach into the folk songs. They didn't have to ask themselves what the animating ethos was, or actually ask themselves serious theological questions, because the poetry was kind of implicit. Well, I hate to say it, but just like our political situation, the British people find themselves, just like the Afrikaner people in South Africa, just like the various European diasporas inside America, they find themselves a diaspora people inside a place that they formerly called their homeland. And there has never been a diaspora people that has survived without faith, that survived without something deep to motivate them. I did want to talk a little bit about this word, though. A while back, I did this talk, or the series of talks called the Magical Word Series. And this is interesting, right? Of course, I did like racism and gender. So a magical word is a word that it doesn't really have a meaning. It only marks you as part of an in-group or an out-group. And, I did about 4 or 5 of them. I think the last one I did was capitalism. And, the problem is that once you do one of them, the other ones are kind of similar. So once you do the explaining how the magic word of racism works, the magic word of fascism works identically. So you're basically just rehashing that word. You're duplicating content. And in 2019, when I was doing this series, I had no need to duplicate content whatsoever. So I just kind of ended it after about 4 of them. But one that was sort of on my radar that was a unique magic word, and I think other people have pointed this one out, is the word folk or folks. This word is one of the most interesting words in the English language because it's been political since its inception, as far as I can figure out. This is sort of an irritating feature of American progressive culture because you always know a shitlib. You always know, like, anytime I hear this, I know I'm talking to a shitlab. When they talk about, well, how about the gay folks, or the queer folks, or the black folks, or the white folks? So-and-so identity, like, us white folks really need to check our privilege. A lot of black folks are disproportionately targeted by police. This is so, and it always comes, I'm exaggerating my speaking pattern, but I'm really trying to capture just how utterly fake this affectation is when progressives do it. And the reason why it's so fake is it's kind of a portmanteau. I don't think I'm using the right word, but it's really a combination of 2 different slang terms, one from the black community and one from the white community. In the African American community, they always refer to themselves as black folks and to white people as white folks. In the white community, the word folks was used sort of more as an endearing thing, like, hello, everyone, like, hi, all you folks, come on in, right? It was never, white folks wouldn't refer to themselves as white folks. They would say white people, or black people. So it's a combination where you have the aw shucks innocence of sort of the early 20th century white culture combined with sort of the African American affectation, and it's always just so incredibly fake. And the other thing is that and the white version of folks, the one that was popular in the early 20th century. It was also intimately connected to progressives in a different way. It was connected more to progressives in the tradition of people like Walt Whitman, or later Woody Guthrie, or maybe even much later Bob Dylan. And the idea was that we're all participating in this collective American culture. We're all participating in this spirit of America, and we're forging what it means to be Americans when we go about and do our daily business, when we go and we live our lives and make our mark on the world. We're all folks here. And you can see this very much carried over in sort of the folk tradition of the 1960s, which is the last place you saw this genuinely occur. Then when there's a folk revival in the 2000s, you kind of see the term revive a little bit again. I was very much on that scene. And then once the Great Awakening happens in 2012, it just dies. And it becomes this insufferable combination where we talk about us as white folks having to check our privilege, or I'm really concerned about there not being enough black folks here, or something like that. It's insufferable. And of course, once you start demarcating identity groups into the concept of folks, the way that early 20th century progressives imagined it, you completely explode the innocence of the original folks project, the original folk project, as people like Walt Whitman imagined it, as sort of a project of nationalist unity. And you immediately reintroduce politics. But in many ways, the African American, this is true for a lot of things actually, because African American culture is so primal, because they're so intimately connected with peoplehood and the realities of power, a lot of times they resist the bullshit of modernity a lot better than white culture does. So white culture has this folk, this sort of folks concept, this everyone's part of the folks, the American folks. I think the African American community has the right definition. And it goes back, I tried to search the etymology for this word. It obviously comes from, I don't know if it comes directly from German of the 19th century, but I couldn't, there's so much written on the etymology of folk, I couldn't get to the bottom of it. It's obviously German derived, and I would be amazed if it did not come directly from Germany in the early 19th century with the emergence of the nationalist movements in Germany. The German concept of Volk, the people, and by the people, they didn't mean some kind of universalist democratic people. They meant it like African Americans do, a very distinct people who had a very distinct history and a very distinct folk way to trace and rediscover. This is the concept universally. We could talk about people rediscovering religion, and certainly I do a lot on this channel. But this is part of the path back to understanding ourselves independently that we need to trace, both as Americans and Europeans. And I think our paths differ significantly, but it all traces straight back through this concept of folkishness, or folk, or even folk music. Obviously, history buffs in the channel will recognize this from the German nationalist movement. It was a word that was very familiar on the lips of people like Wagner, who very famously, he felt distinctly that his music was a nationalist portal through which the German people will rediscover their identity as a people. It's hard to imagine, because in many ways I believe that the period of time when the German states were divided was actually their most culturally productive time. It was the time when you get Gauss and Beethoven and I guess you could count Mozart. I know he was Austrian, but come on. I think you get some of the most fertile cultural period from that period of division. But that was also a period under which, and Napoleon contributed to this distinctly, the German peoples felt like they were a conquered people. And key to overcoming this was developing some kind of folk story or folk consciousness that could be experienced collectively and understood intuitively. This is something that I think it really is intimately connected to music and storytelling. Coincidentally, I think this is also the goal of people like J.R.R. Tolkien, who, not surprisingly, since he named his magnum opus after Wagner's Ring Cycle, believed they were following in the same footsteps of Wagner, trying to develop a new folk consciousness for the English people. In many ways, I think Tolkien and Chesterton and Lewis and the whole crowd of Christian intellectuals, they were really prophetic because they saw, after World War I, the end point of what we're currently experiencing now. In World War I, the nation state as spirituality. Britain is a nation state, and it's a religion, and it's an empire. And you hear this, you get the feeling of this when people like Sargon try to pull a flex on Guardian writers bragging about the British Empire and Winston Churchill. Because this is indeed the spirit of the British Empire. Britain is one thing. It is the crown. It is the Church of England. It is the empire. It is the lion. It is the flag. And as the British person, I embody this. I embrace all elements of this Britishness. It is through me 100%, and there's no, it's one thing. That died at the Somme in 1916. That died in Verdun. World War I killed it. But it was such a large thing that the fumes of it have kept on going and going and going and going. And now Rishi Sunak is prime minister. And this guy is a carbon copy made in the labs of Goldman Sachs. And he's nothing about what that spirituality once was. He doesn't embody it ethnically. He doesn't embody it culturally. He doesn't embody it religiously. And to the extent he does, it's simply a marketing platform. It's simply a way to pull the wool over the eyes of the unsuspecting boomer conservative who would like to believe that there's this process of assimilation through which Ash Sharkar will eventually become just as British culturally as is Laura Towler. This process is bullshit, and I'm not saying that you can't convert to Christianity or develop the cultural affectations of British people or even become British across generations by marrying into the bloodline. But this process is not actually what's going on with the demographic transformation of Europe. This is not another people coming in, merging, and then carrying on. This is something that something is ending in the ascension of Rishi Sunak, or to be more accurate, what I should say is something that has ended is becoming fully apparent as having ended. And this is what people like T.S. Eliot and J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis saw in their experiences in World War I. This is what they were trying to prepare, and they were trying to give the British people. The only thing that would actually survive this process, which is faith and a folk consciousness that would be embodied in things like song and poetry and stories and fantasy stories and fairy tales. That's the path that Britain has to rediscover. And I'm not so sure it can be accomplished without religion, but that's the direction I think people have to be thinking. We're not going to be able to sustain ourselves without it. And I know Morgoth had this entire other essay where he talked about just, we need to go back to the independence we had before the global empire took over our countries and homogenized it, because we were self-sufficient before. And indeed, that might be the ultimate direction. But we're about to go through the eye of the needle here. Independence is an end state. Independence is like the state of nationhood for Germany. It's the end of the journey, not the beginning. And right now, the problem is that the British people in particular and the American people haven't taken the first steps to actually embody this. I'm going to stop talking about Britain because I'm feeling like I'm putting my foot in my mouth. I'm kind of when you're talking about somebody else's country, it's never good form. I feel tightly connected to that place, probably for bad reasons, but it's never good form. People ask me to talk a lot about culture that I like, culture that's changed my life, that's made a really positive influence on me. And whenever I have on Telegram, if you want to follow me, you can give me suggestions on the topics of these threads. People often times say like, "Oh, do a podcast on the Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment." And sure enough, I do try to bring these into a conversation. I don't think that I can do like a book report or talk for an hour on a single book, because A, I think it's going to bore people, and B, to go that deep on any given work, I that would take an enormous amount of research. There's one exception. I thought maybe I'd do an entire talk on the Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce. But I do always want to incorporate culture I appreciate in these podcasts, because I think it's important always to kind of leave people with things they can look at and places they can go afterwards. As a new parent, you can see that music is one of the most important things for young developing children. And folk music is sort of a part of that. That's how we kind of communicate with the next generation and with the generation before us. And as Americans, I think that's where we need to start as right-wingers. It's with sort of foundational elements of folk. It's with the folk, rediscovering the folkways. And in many ways, it's sort of weird because Americans have the opposite problem of the British. Americans have, in some sense, too much folk culture. With British folk culture, it's kind of thin on the ground, but every stalk goes down 1,000 feet into the earth. With America, it's everywhere, but it's all kind of superfluous and young growth stuff. For a while, I was really fascinated with old-time music. I still am. And I think I originally got into it with "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" And that's a great movie by the Coen brothers, still one of my favorites. I could probably talk for about 20 minutes just on "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" alone. But I remember there was a series of movies about folk that came out in the early 2000s. And another one that I really remember is A Mighty Wind, which is sort of a joke mockumentary in the same style as This Is Spinal Tap. And actually, I think it has a lot of the same actors. Maybe even has the same director, I forget. But if you get into American folk music, what you'll soon realize is that it's in sort of A Mighty Wind, it parodies this. Is American folk music is sort of fake all the way down. There's no authentic version of American folk music we recognize. American folk music, like so many things American, it becomes not a parody of itself, but a show of itself in the same generation that it realizes what it is. Just like Sitting Bull, after fighting in the Battle of Bighorn, gets a job in Buffalo Bill's The Wild West show and has a second life reenacting the Battle of Bighorn as an actor. Folk music, the second it's discovered, becomes a produced entity in the early 20th century. There are earlier versions of folk music that you can see people singing back in the 19th century, but it's not understood as folk music. By the time it's folk music or country music, in the sense that people understand it now, it's being processed by the Carter family, who were kind of authentic hillbillies, but also authentically business people. And they had their own brand. I'm going to lift up a book here, one of my favorite histories of American folk music, Country Music USA, will detail this story, by Malone and Neal. But you'll see the same pattern here, is that the people who discover it are also the people who mangle it. Bill Monroe creates bluegrass, but bluegrass is kind of fake. It's like old-time music, but it's way faster. And this whole thing where you're playing these reels of old-timey music with banjos and mandolins is something that comes out of at the earliest the 1930s and wasn't even really popular until the 1940s. American folk music before that, old-time music, is slow. It's twangy. It's oftentimes heartfelt, and the stuff that comes out of the Grand Ole Opry is anything but that. It's kind of raucous, and even Bill Monroe's favorite instrument, the mandolin. The mandolin was not associated with the rural South. The mandolin is an Italian instrument that was brought over by Italian immigrants to Ellis Island, and the big mandolin orchestras were all in places like Chicago and New York and Baltimore and big cities. This was not the function of the rural South like the banjo was. The same thing with blues, although that has a more African American origins. By the time we experience blues as blues, it's all fake. The same blues guys that crawl out of the bayou and are selling you the authentic experience, they're very conscious of themselves as marketers, and they pitch it to an audience of largely white people who they know are going to buy it. I always remember this tidbit of the famous blues artist Lead Belly. For my audience, they'll know that Lead Belly's most popular, well, not his most popular, but one of his most popular songs is The Bourgeoisie Blues. And this had kind of a second life in the 1960s because everyone thought, oh man, like this African guy singing about the bourgeoisie, man, that's like revolutionary. Well, in reality, the real Lead Belly, from what I can discern of his life and biography, was a Republican who like all African Americans before and after, cast his vote continuously for the ruling class establishment party election after election after election. That's been the role of African Americans throughout their entire existence in America. And and Lead Belly was not a communist. But it didn't stop him from marketing sort of a revolutionary song to white people who he knew would buy it. But I'll say this, I don't think it really matters that it is fake after everything is said and done. I think it only matters that it's sincerely felt and that it's sincerely repeated. You can go back further, and for those of you who want another thing that I highly recommend, this is a book that every American should have in their house. It is a thoroughly Protestant book. This is The Sacred Harp, and this is a treasury of old-time American hymns. This would be one of the most common Protestant hymn books in the late 19th century in America. And so many folk songs are derived from songs you can find in this book. And this book contains a whole treasury of songs that were meant to be sung by amateurs in close harmony. You can also go back to just have the Great American Songbook or Rise Up Singing. These are places I think we need to sort of start again rediscovering things. Obviously with myself it's pretty easy to figure out what the next steps are because I have a young child who's just starting to learn how to sing songs. And it's going to be really fun to discover this. But I oftentimes wonder if this isn't sort of a very fertile cultural avenue for people who find themselves more of a distant persuasion. I don't think the left can really touch this stuff anymore. I think it's too hard for them to just touch. At the end of Morgoth's essay, he has this very haunting image that I think is 100% true. He says the most dangerous thing about being a British person in this new age, being an ethnically English person living in England, is that forevermore, the image of you, just the sight of you, is going to be a reminder to the ruling class that their rulership over you is unwelcome and at some level fundamentally illegitimate. For a while, I felt America had a similar relationship with Native Americans, where even at the height of our own triumphalism, we couldn't overcome the fact that our egalitarian ideals had to permit the complete conquest of a continent away from its original native inhabitants. And you could see that it was very hard for American triumphalism to fully conceptualize the Native American in his or her entirety. They had to be kind of pushed to the side. And that's increasingly going to be the reality for elements of folk culture, either of the English or the American variety. It's going to hurt our elites to look at this stuff. It's going to hurt our elites to participate in this stuff because it's going to signal too closely to their enemy's culture. And it's going to remind them of the world that was, then that was obliterated by their actions. I probably should close this here, having gotten through my main spiel of the night. I would want to say that, obviously, I'm not going to dedicate this channel to folk music. You guys can learn it on your spare time, although I'm doing my part having the folk music in the intro and the outro. And I don't think that, we'll see. Maybe someone can write their own folk music. It's more or less just something that you can take into your own personal lives if you want that thing to enrich you. And it certainly will help you communicate your culture to your children because they will not forget that part of their culture. That will eternally be part of their own folkways. And you'll have that connection with them regardless of whatever else they take away from you. Even if you become an absolute minority down to 10% of the original population, the way that the Native Americans did, the way that the Afrikaners did, the way that the Coptic Egyptians did, you'll always have your folkways, and that's ready to preserve. That's always important to preserve. And I don't think you're going to find the preservation of that on YouTube. Although, hell, if you have a folk channel, I'll hit subscribe. I'll listen to it. I'd absolutely love to see that. But really, for us on the online space, really for us, the task here, as we stare down the set of 3 or 4 crises that are going to hit us one after the other. The first one in 10, 12 days time. As we stare down these catastrophes, we're going to have to come up with concepts of friend enemy that actually mean something. I'm really tired of the sort of vicious infighting on the right wing. And, I don't really know what to do about it. I mean, if you're on Twitter, the whole system is set up to facilitate fighting. And if you do microblogging in any form, you're going to get your hands dirty with that. If you're not on Twitter, you're going to have people sparking out on your Telegram feed. And, I guess the only way to get rid of this entirely is just to never touch microblogging whatsoever. But that being said, the fighting is not just with people that you only know online. This can occur to people that you know to be friends in real life. And that's because the amount of diversity in the dissident movement is so broad, it's so thick, that no one can really erect standards around it. So I did try to elucidate standards on my kind of defunct Twitter, kind of reestablished Twitter account. I wrote out sort of 20 points of what sort of I think is good online etiquette. One thing I've discovered is when I wrote this out, when I wrote these 20 points out, and you can go read them if you want to follow my links to my kind of fake Twitter account to get all 20 points. And it was a very popular thread. But what I realized for myself is just this whole pet peeve of what I believe to be kind of vicious cycle counter signaling. These conversations that never, ever, ever move on from their base patterns they're in. Again, the 3 ones that come to mind are the trad dad conservatism of people like Rod Dreher and the First Things crowd, the pickup artist community, and the neo-pagans. These are what I call sort of chatbot reset conversations. They always begin a certain way, and they always end a certain way. The pickup artist conversation always begins with the pickup artists counter-signaling Christian morality and claiming that we're giving men bad advice. But then, if you follow this thread long enough, if you argue with them, you'll get an admission that they have no alternative morality that could work at a collective level other than what is functionally Christian morality, and that their advice is either identical to Christian morality, maybe with some dating tips thrown in, Here's a dating tip to all the young men out there. Combine my first advice and my second advice and teach yourself how to play acoustic guitar. I'm just saying that used to work wonders back in the day. Make folk singer part of your public personality. It will do wonders for your dating prospects. But you'll discover with the pickup artists that their advice either is identical to Christian advice, or it deviates in one or two ways that are just batshit insane and couldn't possibly work, and that exist in sort of a fantasy realm, more than an actual lived dating experience of someone who could actually, they exist in some kind of weird ultra macho dating simulator that exists in these people's brains. And the same thing, like neo-pagans. What is it with neo-pagans? Neo-pagans is, the conversation starts out that Christianity is slave morality and created progressivism and is a dead end. That's how the conversations with neo-pagans always begin. How they always end is, well, there really is no difference between neo-pagans and, neo-paganism it's not coherent. It's just a loose set of emotions. It doesn't have to make sense because it's a religion. Religions do have to make sense, unfortunately. They can be sort of rational in the sense that they're not proved by logic, but they can't flout logic. They can't contain explicit contradictions that aren't constructions of poetry like Zen koans. They can't be incoherent. They can't be nonsense. Otherwise, it's just meaningless. But by the end of the conversations with neo-pagans, the end point is, oh, well, it's all just a bunch of emotions. It's not meant to make any sense. There's no theology. And when you really think about it, paganism and Christianity are the same thing. That's how the conversation ends. And then when we get to that point, we hit the chatbot reset button, and in a few months, the conversation begins right back from where we started, calling Christianity slave morality and for cucks, even though a month ago they were saying it was the same thing as the religion they now supposedly follow. That conversation is fake. I'm not saying that the emotions behind it are fake, but the conversation is fake. And just for good order, I'll throw in the trad dad and neoconservative Christian angle. The Rod Dreher fake conversation. And it's not just Rod Dreher, because this whole thing is a pattern. There might be a British equivalent to this. I'm sure there is. But this is very much an American phenomenon. So the trad dad conservative blogger, he starts out, he wakes up in 2022. But for him, somehow he's Rip Van Winkle. And he went to bed his brain turned off in 2005. And he still thinks that America is under the hegemony of white Christian middle America. And there's this deal. Well, everyone's just going to assimilate into that. And sure, we have some crazies and the progressives, but those are fringes. And then, so he wakes up on Monday believing that. And then over the course of his week, he reads articles. And every article he reads, he's shocked. He's shocked at progressive hegemony. He's shocked that Joe Biden is interviewing what really should be a troll account of a trans person on TikTok. He's shocked that suddenly Drag Queen Story Hour isn't a one-time thing, but everywhere. And so unlike David French, he's not telling me it's a good thing. But sort of more frustratingly, unlike David French, he never actually comes to a conclusion. Because as he gets increasingly shocked at every given article in a week, he goes to bed on Sunday night saying, oh, wow, America has changed. America is dead. We need to come to terms with this new reality. He goes to bed, and then the next week, he woke up, and it's like his brain's still back in 2005 again. Nothing's changed. Again and again and again and again. And in all three of these cases, the solution for myself, it's got a two-word name. I'm not going to pull a Joe Biden and say 3 words now, but it's got a 2-word name, and the solution for myself is the mute button. I love these guys. They're great people. I can't do this circular conversation anymore. I can tell you how I refute your position, but then your chatbot's going to reset. And then on Monday, we're going to be having the same conversation again. So these conversations just need to quietly stop happening. But the most important thing, though, and maybe if you're in one of these groups, you can do me this favor. And this is one of my points about how I distinguish friend from enemy. Everyone does this a little bit, so I'm not going to hold you against it if you do this. But please, like, don't counter signal me using the language of the left. I mean, really don't. It's fine if you're a pagan and you think that Christianity is a false religion. It's fine even if you think that it led to a lot of the problems we have right now. But once you're sort of recycling sort of these talking points that are copy pasted from Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? This is not. You understand how this looks. If you're using the left's language, and you're using the left's narratives, you're feeding into the leftist attack on your own group, your own goal and yourself. And so your complaints, I'm sure they're legitimate, but please, differentiate them, at least in terms of tone and language, from the narratives that your enemies are using to completely destroy your society. That's minimum. If you're a pickup artist, don't feed me this bullshit about how the sexual revolution didn't happen and how women always cheated on their husbands before the 1960s. It was just a free-for-all. People just talked about it less. No, that's progressive bullshit. We can look at genetic studies and see that didn't happen. There wasn't a cuckold rate that was above 1% minimum. From mitochondrial DNA, we can see this. And I know you want to own the Christians and show how men just need to cynically abandon any pretense of monogamy. But when you repeat the bullshit of progressives, you're feeding their narrative and you're helping them break the coalition. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this one. But if you're someone like Rod Dreher, why are you clutching your pearls about anti-liberal and post-liberal thought on the right wing? Why are you clutching your pearls over white identity politics? If our political system, as you discover every week, every month, is dominated by a racial politics of people who are not white and who obviously have the ears of the ruling class more than the quote-unquote white people on the outs, white identity politics, stupid or not, and I tend to be a person who thinks that it's not a good strategy at all, is just a natural outgrowth of the decline you yourself weekly point out. And to moralize over it is just, again, a signal to your enemies that their narrative is correct and they can divide any distant group by taking this narrative angle and using your audience against people who are obviously trying to advocate for their interests in a real way. I don't know. Is there a possible way that we could stop doing this? Is there a possible way that we could stop sort of using the language and the frame of the left to dunk on each other? I don't know. I guess this challenge is just impossible for Twitter. As long as those Reddit tier, and you know these Reddit tier takes are bullshit. I might have disagreements with white nationalists. And so, like, I could reach for the Redditeer observation that white nationalists just want to lean on their race because they're losers in real life. I know that's bullshit, though. I know that that's not what the people who call themselves white nationalists, although no one calls themselves that anymore, I know that's not what they believe. I know that's not how they act. But that stone is always there for me to toss because it plays well on Reddit and it plays well on Twitter. Guys, just stop doing this. Use an intellectual tone that does not countersignal other people inside the distant community, because that will be a point of contention. There's no way that will not be used by your enemies to turn friends into enemies. And really, at this stage, for people who are conquered people, we need all the friends we can get. We need all the friends we can get, because one day a friend who has a different point of view from yours will become an ally, will become a compatriot, will become a co-belligerent. and we'll create something new that will become a new culture, and that will become the foundation for a new people. And that's going to look different from what we have now. And the longer it takes to find the people who truly have our interests at heart, the further away we are from actually having something that we can call our own, and the further away we are from building true civilizational roots that could actually last. So that's the end of the monologue portion of this stream. I'm now going to go to super chats. That was a little more than an hour, but I think I'm more or less on time here. You can tell that I'm kind of recovering from a little bit of a cold, a little bit of a sore throat, so my nose is stuffed up. Pardon me. I wonder why that is. Okay, so let's go to the super chats. I think I should probably have some kind of transition screen so people can get their super chats in. But whatever. I always want to do these things, and I never remember to do them by the end of the next week. Okay, so the first super chat of the night is that. It's not pinning for some reason. Here we go. Mim the Dwarf for $5 USA. Happy Halloween and happy autumn to all. In the spirit of the season, any gothic horror books or film recommendations? I've read Dracula, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Lovecraft, and I don't know where to look next. Well, I always really liked the sort of classic ghost stories so the two classic authors of ghost stories would be Ambrose Bierce in America and M.R. James in Britain. Honorable mention should go to the which one was it? I can't remember which James it was. Was it William James? One of the James brothers was an author, and he wrote, for all my luck, it's probably going to be the guy who wrote Variety of Religious Experience, which is not the person I'm talking about, but he wrote the classic story, A Turn of the Screw, which, I mean, that still maintains pretty well. You know, it still maintains pretty well. I was always... Yeah, I mean, The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. It's always hard to know because a lot of these Victorian ghost stories, they're very sort of... for a modern mind, they're very laboriously paced. They're not... most people in America, they're used to sort of Twilight Zone pacing for the stories of the weird and the bizarre. And so the Twilight Zone pacing is... it's very snappy. It wraps up in like a 20-minute sitting. But something like Turn of the Screw goes on and on and on and on. It's a Victorian pacing, and you really have to be on board for the eventual payoff. But yeah, I mean, W.W. Jacobs, M.R. James, Ambrose Bierce, whatever the James brother is who wrote A Turn of the Screw, those are my go-to short story writers. And of course, I'm sure you know this one, H.P. Lovecraft. That's a good one as well. To be honest, though, to answer this honestly, I've always been more partial to the pulp and the stories targeted at children than the ones that are written in sort of the proper Victorian ghost story style, which oftentimes can be so long that you lose the point. The book I always remember, and this one certainly holds up, is the classic children's book, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. A series of mostly American ghost stories, but some British ones that is just deliciously illustrated in black and white, and they're all really, really, really tight. They're all quick reads. They're designed for like a third grade audience, and boy, are they spooky. Boy, are they spooky. There's something about them, something about the simplicity of them, just adds to the absolute creepy dimension of those stories. And I always remember them as being kind of nice and creepy stories. obviously shows like The Twilight Zone are really good. Again, hot take, guys. But another one that I was the movie that always scared me as a kid that I rewatch every Halloween is the really crappy Stephen King's Creep Show, which is itself sort of a parody of Tales of the Crypt and comics that had this kind of pulp dimension to them. And I always love sort of Tales of the Crypt, the original comics. The HBO show was, other than a really original Crypt Keeper that's kind of, thanks to the 80s, is kind of burned into our retina as the image of the Crypt Keeper from Tales of the Crypt. The HBO show doesn't really hold up, in my opinion. But the episodic TV show that has the creepy ending or the murder ending, I always really love those. The 1970s Tales from the Crypt is, it's a classic. I remember growing up with it. I remember it having a really kind of cool payoff. Not do all the stories hold up? No, but it's one of those movies where it's like 4 short stories in a movie form, and I've always really, really loved those. To me, to be really good, horror has to be short. The 2-hour horror movie, I don't know if it ever really did it for me until things like The Witch and Hereditary kind of came out, and those are kind of traumatic spiritual experiences because they just so accurately display spiritual corruption and demon possession that they kind of scare me. It kind of makes me wonder whether I should be watching it at all, to be quite honest. And so I always have a hard time recommending those. The Exorcist from the 70s is kind of, I don't want to say it doesn't hold up. To my mind, the first 20 minutes of that, the first 15 minutes of The Exorcist with the priest going around the city of Mosul, that's just a masterpiece of filmmaking. And the lead up to the exorcism is a masterpiece of filmmaking. And it's really only a movie that could be made in the 70s. Sort of the peak of atheism is also the one where all of this corruption obviously seeps into American culture and sits there indelibly until it finally manifests where we are now. But again, it's a 2-hour horror movie, and the payoffs aren't very good in my opinion. But just that first part of The Exorcist is a masterpiece, in my opinion. So I hope that's enough spooky stuff for you in terms of recommendations, Mim the Dwarf. But I'll go on to the next super chat. Okay, that is a question. I got to get rid of this question. It's irritating. Ben White for $5 USA. What do you think of Xi's alleged purge of Hu Jintao? If China invades, do you think the West would defend Taiwan? I think due to their chip production and geographical location, it's even more important for the West when compared to Ukraine. Yeah, but I guess the question is, I think an actual invasion is just so not Chinese. I think, this is just sort of a temperamentally, there's this expression called the Chinese last warning, China's last threat, I think it's called. It's a figure of speech that's really something more from the 19th century. And it's the Chinese last offer, the Chinese last threat is used to indicate an ultimatum that has no teeth because the Chinese never made good on any of their threats. China does not like fast change as a culture, generally speaking. And Xi Jinping has proved again and again that he would much rather win slowly and reliably than win dramatically and quickly. And I don't think that he's going to make a move on Taiwan, especially since it seems like his position sort of surrounding Taiwan by making encircling alliances with places like the Solomon Islands is bearing fruit. I think he wants to be in a situation where Taiwan is so isolated that it's impossible to even imagine the West putting up a fight and then sort of trying to annex it that way. And I don't think anyone's going to make a move until this whole Ukraine-Russia thing is over and until the energy crisis is over. Nobody knows who the victor is going to be. And if the victor is Russia, I could see the time frame moving up. But if the victor is Russia, then the State Department in America is going to have cascading problems in maintaining its alliances. Because if Russia wins the Russia-Ukraine war, all of their connections across all of Europe and across Africa and across the Midwest are going to be thinking to themselves, wait a minute, why am I cozying up to you, State Department, when it's obvious you can't defend your allies? You're just going to get me killed like you got the Ukrainians killed. You're just going to get me into into a large amount of trouble, and you're not going to be able to get me out, and you're not even going to back me up. And so the State Department's problems are going to multiply if Russia wins that war. And a new global reality is going to start emerging. Immediately, I think that you'll see politically inside Taiwan, pro-independence candidates lose. Because it will be very, very apparent both that China can invade them, China eventually will invade them, and that any attempt to resist an invasion by China from America will be unsuccessful and will virtually destroy that country. Ukraine is basically destroyed. Even if Ukraine and the global American empire win this conflict, Ukraine will never demographically recover from this. The country will be destroyed. And in all likelihood, they're going to make up their population decline through general immigration coming in from Asia, most likely, maybe Africa. That's in all likelihood where the new Ukrainian citizens are going to come from to make up for all the population they lost during the war. Ukraine might not even exist as a people after this war. They're the losers. And the Taiwanese will know this and will probably adjust their political persuasions to be more friendly with China, which is exactly the kind of slow death by 1,000 cuts that the Chinese are so fond of generally as a people, and that Xi Jinping seems to be so fond of as a leader in particular. PBK for $20 USA. Hi, Dave, longtime listener, first time super chatter. I have 2 questions. How did you get to know so much seemingly about every subject? Is this the power of continually reading? Yeah. Some might argue it's a part of my power of bullshitting too. Second question is there anywhere I can find your conversation with Michael Malice? You're my 2 favorite creators. Thanks for all you do. I've never talked to Michael Malice. I don't think I've ever talked to Michael Malice. I'm sorry. Maybe I should. I probably should, but I don't think I've ever talked to him, so I'm sorry about that. Is he thinking of somebody else, perhaps? Yeah, update me, PBK, if you're thinking of somebody else, because it's certainly not Malice. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah, so to answer your other question, though, I think the 2 ways I kind of develop my opinions first is by reading. And, through a lot of my 20s, I read a lot, and I read a lot less now because I have less time with the family. But the second thing is to kind of read in between the lines. And this is something that you can kind of, you can obtain a lot of knowledge this way, which is sort of listen to people talk about what they love and reconstruct their worldview from that. This is also a good debate tactic as well. And sort of whenever you hear someone's worldview, put yourself in their shoes and try to piece together what the steelman position of their views are, and then just ask questions about it in your own mind. there's this, I took the stupid communication class in undergraduate, and I got this piece of advice that is, it's done me very well across my entire life. And the professor, this is a stupid no-brainer class that was a joke, but the professor at one stage said, is that the biggest problem most people make is to think that the first time they see an idea, they know everything about it. The classic example, and this applies especially to Americans, is they see a word and they hear the definition once and they think they know what that word means and they never look it up. He said, never be afraid to look up a word, even if you think you know the definition. And if you don't know the definition, you certainly should look it up anyway. So much of knowledge is just knowing the right definition of words and filling in the gaps of people's worldviews and filling in the gaps of your own worldview. There's this thing where, okay, I'll give you an example here of this. So let's say you're taking a geography class or you're taking a history class. Now, this is something that people used to do, but they don't do anymore. And this is a shame. Back in the day, if you were to take a history class, what the teacher would do would say, draw a timeline with all the dates for the period we're studying. Maybe if it's world history or modern world history, that would be the last 2,000 years. Or if it's world geography, it would be draw a map of the world. Or if it's European geography, draw a map of Europe or draw a map of America. From your own brain. Just put what's in your brain on the paper. Just do it. And of course, your first attempt to do this as a freshman or as a high schooler or as a first year is horrible. And then after you take the class, the professor says, now do it again. And of course, everybody can do it. Everyone can do it much better. They can draw a timeline. They can draw a map of the world. Okay, so this is the anathema to modern teachers because they think it involves memorization, which it certainly does involve memorization. But memorization is being used to the service of a much more important concept, which I like to call integration. The reason why it's easy to remember historical facts is that they're not random facts. They get inserted into a timeline. So let's say, for instance, that you were to tell me that I don't know. I'm drawing a blank here on terms of, I'm thinking something in the 17th century, right? But if you were to tell me something like Adam Smith wrote his novel, his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, I would immediately know he did that at the same time as this Constitution, or sorry, the Declaration of Independence. My bad. And I would immediately be able to place it in relationship to the revolution in France in the 1790s. And then later, when I hear about the revolutions in France in 1848, I immediately think to myself, okay, well, that's, 50 years later. That's 2 generations after the original revolution in France. And so what you're able to do, what the timeline gives you, is whenever you hear something like the date of the 30 Years' War, or the publication of Leviathan, or the English Civil War, and you hear it's like 1680 something, or 1643, or blah, 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 right? All these dates, they all go over your head. But when you put them in a timeline, you're aware that, okay, so when Thomas Hobbes is writing his Leviathan, he's looking back on the English Civil War and the wars of religion. And people like Frederick the Great are looking back on this period of conflict religiously. And they're looking forward to other ideas that come from people like, they're coming from contemporaries. And so to see things in the context, you need the memorization to put things in context. And the ideas are only memorable when they're put in context. You're only reminded of where countries really are when you think of borders. And borders imply conflict. You're only comfortable thinking of historical events when you think of what they inspired and what inspired them, or thinkers in terms of who they were trying to answer and who they in turn influenced, and who answered them in turn. Once you have sort of a working timeline and important milestones on that timeline, your absorption of historical facts is that much faster. And the same thing is true for the world map in your brain. You can immediately remember where Poland is because you remember that they have a land border with both Germany and with Russia, which in many ways is the most important thing about Poland. So, I mean, that's my advice for being a learner. Ghost of Gen Z for $3 USA. As a young guy, how do you deal with outgrowing your past friends? While they grow ever more leftist and face addiction, my life is getting more orderly. Tips for dealing with this grief of a sort? Well, I don't know. Well, I do have some advice, but I'll say that this is something I struggle with a lot myself, having lost a lot of my friends to leftism. And I lost them I lost them not as a young man. I lost them in my mid-30s for the most part, right around the Trump election and afterwards, right around the time I started my YouTube channel. Really, if you're a young guy, this sounds trite and this sounds cheap, and this is the advice that I hated to get in high school. Oh, we'll just make new friends. But you have to be aware of the fact that you will make new friends. And a lot of these people from your earlier life, you're going to lose contact with them anyway. There are some friends that you will just never lose contact with because they're so close to you. They'll always be contacts. Or they'll be family members. And I certainly have a lot of progressive family members. Really, the question is, which are we talking about? Are we talking about the acquaintances that are so thoroughly linked to you by some outstanding or magnificent or great magnitude event in your life that you'll never, you went to war with them or something, right? Your army buddies that you'll never be able to leave them, or they're your family or your in-laws. If that's the case, just don't talk. I mean, just bear witness to where we are as a country. You're going to meet up with them and just describe reality as you see it. As a reactionary, your presence is more toxic to them than theirs is to you. You're not going to be, in all likelihood, you're not going to be outside of the actual peer group, outside of the actual egregore. You're not going to be tempted back into making mistakes like they do. And in the meantime, your presence as a rational individual who's just reacting to the world as it exists, that's absolutely fatal to their existence as progressives. But based on the nature of your question, Ghost of Gen Z, I'm assuming that you're dealing with people who you've actually broken ties with. I would just find new people to be friends with. It's hard after COVID. It's very hard after COVID, but this is part of a natural process that you're going to, and it's not even political. Like, it just, if you moved out of your hometown, you lose contact with these people also. So it's, we're just going to all have to move on and make new deep relationships with people that we meet in the real world. Ghost of Gen Z for $3 USA. Another question for you, Dave. How can men be more loyal to each other in regards to the dating scene? To me, this means that high quality men settle instead of spinning plates. Well, I mean, you're sort of preaching to the choir, right? I've tried to illustrate this point again and again and again and again and again to pick up artists, that by implicitly or sometimes even explicitly telling men to spin plates, they're actually making things worse and harder for all men in the proximity of the men who do that. And the closer they are in community with those men, the more destructive that plate spinning behavior is going to be. I don't know. The problem is that you just aren't going to talk men into not doing this kind of thing. They're going to do it. Really, they're going to stop doing it when they lose privileges. And really, there's just going to have to be certain doors that close to people who continuously in public refuse to actually acknowledge proper sexual ethics, and that in some ways preach against it. There are just going to have to be certain doors that close, and they're going to have to learn by being excluded. The first door that's going to have to close is groups that date inside religions. Obviously, if your religion or if your religious dating group has people who are advocating for pickup artist stuffs, just boot them out. They're violating the rules. Obviously, and if you don't do that, you're just, abusing yourself. Again, this is just, don't, for yourself, obviously, find a community that has dating rules and follow those rules. And if you make a mistake, if you screw up, confess and try again, and try to be the best person you possibly can be. But one thing you should not try to do, don't try to argue the pickup artist people into following the rules. Just establish the rules, and if they violate them, or if they even talk about violating them, kick them out. And that's the only advice that really can be given. There needs to be a similar conversation with women at this stage. And this is what also frustrated me about this talking to this community. It's just the horrible advice they give to women. They seem to think that telling women to seek monogamy, the way they structure this is, oh, well, women aren't going to believe this because the highest quality men are going to be non-monogamous. And in order for them to get an alpha male, they're going to have to date non-monogamous men and just provide value with them until they commit. Seriously, if you're one of the few women who watch my show, this is the absolute worst advice you could give your daughters. As a woman, your dating strategy should not be to just sort of let your libido go wherever it may, and once you've decided on the man who your libido wants in some sort of platonic form, just start a relationship and try to provide more value to him than like the other 5 chicks he's dating along with you. I can't believe that this is actual advice that I've heard pickup artists giving women, but I have heard them giving this advice to women. And it's batshit insane, which is why no fathers give this advice to their daughters. When men tell their daughters to always look for a commitment before intimacy, what they are informing is their daughters' standards for men. Both, it's not just meant to be a requirement for a relationship. It's also implicitly telling the daughters what they should desire, which anybody who understands female psychology and human psychology to a lesser extent should realize that an enormous amount of what women find attractive is what they're told to find attractive. And so treating women's desires as if they're some kind of absolute unchangeable platonic form belies that they've adopted the modern perception in a way that causes their own advice to be absolutely terrible. So there needs to be a conversation with women about how they go about dating too. But at the end of the day, these standards have to be applied externally. This cannot be a debate. This is not a discourse where we discover that this rule should be applied. This is not a conversation about how much we need to make commitment or how much we can cheat on it. It just needs to be a standard that's applied, and you need to kick out everyone who doesn't follow it within reason. Maybe the pickup artist guy is a great author. Maybe he writes a great Substack. Maybe he's one of your friends in real life. But insofar as your community follows this rule and believes in it, he gets kicked out of everything, of all social life. You can read his Substack, but he can't get in the door. That's the solution. Period. And there's no other way around it. And doors will have to start closing for these people in real ways. There's no way, because the religion is obviously not believable if it does not enforce its own rules. All right, Numtooth Bum for $5 USA. Senor, is there anything left worth dying for in this world? Is there anything left dying for in this world? Well, sure. Your family is worth dying for. Your faith is worth dying for. Holiness is worth dying for. I don't think your country is worth... a country is worth dying for. A country for your people is worth dying for. Your friends are worth dying for. But your fake friends aren't worth dying for. And certainly a country that's declared itself to be the enemy of your people and who's dedicated itself to dispossessing them is certainly not worth dying for. The things that are worth dying for are the things that speak to you sincerely and that make vows of loyalty to you that they're willing to keep, implicitly or explicitly. I know of no way of determining friend and enemy among people who are not willing to take moral vows prescriptively to something and prescriptively to something that we both commonly believe in. Without that, friend-enemy is meaningless, and this whole idea that we'll make sacrifices of any kind, up to and maybe including our lives, is ridiculous to even discuss in any realistic context. We still have lots of things that are worth dying for. We just don't have anything big that's worth dying for. And so, regardless, everyone in this chat is going to have to dedicate their lives, maybe their deaths, to things that are in this world very, very small. But maybe in the grand scheme of things that are larger, that are maybe even infinitely large, hopefully infinitely large. But thank you for that unguided prompt. Ben White for $3 USA. Many USA pension funds bought bonds on margins similar to the UK pension funds. I think the Fed will give up its fight against inflation and start printing money again. The left can't afford to lose. Well, this is what really scares me. And, everyone complains about BlackRock, and sure enough, and I don't think BlackRock's the only company that's doing it, but it's these sort of mutual funds or we used to call them mutual funds, these sort of investment firms that just buy up a bunch of assets and wait for them to appreciate so that they can flip them and so that they can create combinations in portfolios that have risk profiles that are good enough for other things to buy. The black pill is that these companies are buying up all the land in America so that none of the middle class can actually own it and have houses to live on. The real black pill is to understand that this is essential because of how we've set up our Social Security Ponzi schemes. All of these Social Security Ponzi schemes need to have assets that grow at a certain rate. Otherwise, they're all going to be inflated away by the time the baby boomers are done sucking out the financial assets of them, which means that they need to essentially secure assets in real estate. So ultimately, what this BlackRock represents, it might be a power grab by elites, but more fundamentally, it's a power grab of generations. What they're trying to do is they're trying to put all of the real estate behind a barrier so that all of the other young people, whether they're natives or immigrants, have to work that much harder in order to get their house at the end of the rainbow. And in the process of doing that, they have to work that much harder and feed into an economy so that the baby boomers and the Xers soon can start drawing their Social Security checks for longer and longer and longer. The whole thing is wired up in a completely unsustainable way. And we're going to have either financial collapse or hyperinflation, and it's going to start kicking in again after this election. Reality will reassert itself in November, and it will continue reasserting itself until 2024, when the Democrats need to win another election, in which case they'll try to suspend it again, but then probably for less time and less convincingly. All right, Nerve and VMaker. The right focuses on the emptiness of current art, but not as much on its total technical decline. Everything from animation to prose writing is a cheap imitation of everything of previous eras. I see the right praise works, but not being woke, despite the work being of low artistic worth. All anime post the 1990s. Well, yeah, I know Nerve and VMaker. I think you and I were sort of commiserating on the state of anime, which you could argue that all anime is kind of degenerate from the outset. But I can't remember if it was you or Fritz Imperial who pointed me to the reality that anime from the 70s and 80s, and I think of things here like Vampire Hunter D or some of the very early mecha anime, and you can certainly see this in things like Akira, it was pretty based. I mean, you look at the characters in Akira, and especially for men you see in Asian cinema, they're very masculine. They came off as masculine when I saw Akira in the 90s, and they came off as they come off as hyper masculine when you watch Akira now. And then, and right up through in the 1990s, you still had very masculine properties in anime. And then sometime around Evangelion, that was really where the decline set in, where the barrier between the harem anime and the serious anime was broken down fundamentally, and everything sort of slid into the path we are in right now. So I mean, you could definitely see decline in the 90s anime. But I think technicality is sort of a red herring. I think the technical obsession is something that we should always be aware of. But really, when it comes to seeing decline in form and seeing decline in essence, I always want to prefer the decline in essence. I think of the Vampire Hunter series. So there was Vampire Hunter D from 1980s, and there was a Vampire Hunter D in the 2000s, and both are pretty good. But in the Vampire Hunter D in the 2000s, although it's technically much better, you can already see the influences of Hollywood and the influences of sort of progressivism pervading into the narrative, whereas the 80s is much truer to its roots in pulp novellas like Solomon Kane. And certainly Vampire Hunter D is pretty much a ripoff of Solomon Kane. So I don't know. I think that really what we're looking for actually is just some piece of art that is very much, it is what it is. I'm just here to be a thing that people can appreciate as art. And, I think anime tells that story. But I'm going to move on because I've got a lot of super chats building up. Numtooth Bum for $5 USA. I can see where the cast is going. You likely answered my earlier questions already. I'm going into the seminary next year, and I'm terrified. This is your fault, though I would throw some more money your way. Well, it still matters. Love you, man. Well, good luck on the seminary. I'll give you what warnings I can, but the Catholic leadership is deeply been corrupted, and I know a lot of people who've had bad experiences with certain seminaries, so I really hope you find one that can meet your spiritual needs. I have a few priest friends, one who's appeared on this podcast before, and I really owe them an email because I need to have them back on the podcast and, interview them about matters spiritual, because that needs to be front and center. Rediscovering our spirituality, rediscovering the poetry that exists in spirituality. Really, all prayers that are said well take on poetic form, and all poems that are said sincerely have a prayer-like element to them. And that's something that I think has been lost among so many modern clergy. God bless you, and I'm going to pray for your success in your career choice. But thank you again for the super chat. Morgan Allen for $10 USA. Just adding to the tip jar. Have a good evening. Well, thank you very much, Morgan Allen, not the least of which, because I can get through these and answer more questions. Oros Post for $5. By the way, great channel, everyone. Check out Oros Post. I think it's an interview channel, if I'm not mistaken. But check it out. Oros Post for $5 USA. The transformation might be painful. I am prepared for the consequences. My feathers have molted. I am birthed anew. I am consumed by the primordial beasts calling out to me through my dreams. Dave, I will answer the beck and call. I will become. Well, thank you. Very poetic. That sounds very Walt Whitman-y, to be quite honest. Are you paraphrasing Whitman here? I wouldn't be surprised. But we have a Promethean transformation in front of us. And that's what we have to undertake in our lives at this stage. There's no going back. We are a dispossessed people. And we will not be the same people coming out of this as we were going in. You know, I talked to the whole former white nationalist crowd or ethno-nationalist or just nationalist crowd. This needs to be a broader discussion, but nationalism is a huge problem. And there's so many reasons why I suspect it, and also why I don't like this Christian nationalism thing. But you can see, in ethno-nationalism, you can see the flaws of it right now because your ethnicity is being destroyed. Sure, you will have a new ethnicity on the back end of this process, but in many ways it will be a new ethnicity created from a variety of other threads that survive this cataclysm. My own ethnicity, or really my father's, is a very specific ethnicity of Germans called the Danish-Swabians, a specific set of German colonists that came from Ulm, Germany, and colonized around the Danube River across Eastern Europe. This culture it was a distinct culture from German culture, but this culture is dead. I mean, it is dead. And I can't will it back into existence. I can't, because my prospects of meeting women who are from this very particular culture, and this culture was really very particular to one given town in this migration, not even the whole thing. One given town. The prospect of meeting someone from this community is minuscule in the modern world. To find new community, I have to find a new way in the world that I actually live in. Ethnicities die and are reformed into new versions of themselves. And the last thing I want to be is the adherent of a dead ethnicity, of a dead people. Like I said before in the last podcast, sort of dedicating myself to entombing and embalming this thing that has long since shuffled off the mortal coil. It is absolutely essential that we guard our own heritage culturally and genetically, and our own posterity, which is my preferred term, both culturally, religiously, and genetically. But that's going to look like, it's going to look like a much more twisted and interleaved process in this kind of concept of the way nationalists used this idea in the early 20th century. And the last thing you want to do is try to flex power you don't have. And the same thing is true for Christian nationalism. Nationalism itself, it's like Swiss cheese for our opponents. They use nationalism, they use Ukrainian nationalism to essentially kill the Ukrainian people. Right now, Ukrainians are dying, their entire civilization is going to die in the name of Ukrainian nationalism at the behest of globalist leaders who don't even believe in nationalism of any variety. Polish nationalism is used to feed the guilt of German nationalists. Scottish nationalism is used to subvert the policies of broader British nationalism designed to maintain any kind of demographic coherency in the British Isles, period. So our enemies are perfectly able and willing to use one nationalism to subvert the other. They're perfectly willing to make the perfect be the enemy of the good. And they do that, and nationalism is a tool for them doing that. And so whenever I hear something like Christian nationalism, I hear nationalism and my bristles automatically go up because I feel like it's going to be used to subvert the very kind of things that we're trying to preserve into the future. The thread of posterity, the thread of folkways, the consistency of our faith tradition as it mutates slightly through the process of cataclysm and reformation and new ethnogenesis to become a new people. That process, we're going to be pushed towards this extinction by this tool of nationalism wielded at the hand of our enemies. And I hate this every time I see this. But anyway, I know Aaron McIntyre is talking to Paul Vanderklay about the topic of Christian nationalism, and I hope that they hit on some of these topics. But I know Paul Vanderklay is very much in his own path, so I will probably not comment on that wisely. Novum, $5. I like to develop 3D video games in my spare time, purely for the love of the craft. I'm also very aware of the cultural drawbacks they have brought on society. I aspire to create a small RPG in the vein of Morrowind gameplay-wise, and I'm trying to think of more reactionary films in the story and gameplay. And the idea, I don't know. I think that maybe the story that I already discussed last podcast that the many barriers for having video games being art because of the fact that video games fundamentally are sort of a dopamine hit machine. And so they're very difficult to pair with things that are art, which need, by definition, to have your dopamine receptors like turned off or turned down for a moment so that you can appreciate a moment of quiet profundity. So I won't belabor that point again. But if there was just a story that I yearn to be told, it's a person, tell me the story of a settler. Tell me the story of somebody who's part of a diaspora and that finds a new life for his people, that founds a new society. Tell me the story of Joshua from the Bible. Or tell me the story of Isaac, or maybe the story of Hagar and Ishmael, if you want to be apocryphal about the whole thing. Tell me the story of a patriarch that actually creates a people from a people who have lost everything, and the various different things that have to be given up, and the various things that are carried forward, and what that looks like. You know, for all of the things that people don't like in the Bible, the Old Testament is a record of not one, but two different ethnogenesises. Maybe three, depending on how you read Genesis. It's a story of a people becoming a people across two different cataclysms. One being the escape from Egypt, and the other one being the Babylonian captivity. Again, you could also say that Genesis told another one of these stories. Why couldn't there be a Skyrim or Morrowind that tells that story, or whose protagonist is a part of that story? And, you know, maybe you know, to use one of the last video games, I did play Fallout New Vegas. Fallout New Vegas tells the story of a cataclysm and a pivotal point in history, a pivotal war that's fought, and then it alludes to what happens after that war is fought and won or lost, or what side wins that war. And one of the things that I always felt was depressing about this is it goes to great lengths to describe the individual characters of the story and how their lives go on and are changed by the events, but never really tells you what happens to the people, to the broad collectives, with the exception of this horribly shit-lib organization called the New Californian Republic, which you're supposed to think is the good guy. No one tells you how various different ethnicities evolve and are created. Does this character go forward and start a new people who, blossom in the wasteland as a new group of people who carry forward into the future in a new nation? That would be the kind of story I'd want to hear. Although, granted, I don't play 3D video games, so I'd really rather hear about it in the form of a movie or a TV show than a video game. But given that your craft, go ahead and make your video game. Always be building, as I'm fond of saying. Cultist of Shub Niggurath for $3 USA, copying the name of my favorite Lovecraftian god, Shub Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. To my knowledge, the only female elder god, a very Kali-like character from Hindu mythology. I like this character from Lovecraft so much. I originally thought I might name my channel after it. Then I realized that there was literally an N-bomb in the literal word, which probably would have ended my channel if the wrong text interpreter had gotten hold of it. But I hope you're not trying to get my channel banned by using the name Shub Niggurath in getting me to say it out loud. Cultist says, I am now older than George Orwell when he died. I will soon be older than Jack Kerouac when he died. Anyway, wondered why all of these people killed themselves. Kurt Vonnegut. Well, George Orwell didn't kill himself, did he? I mean, maybe he did something that accidentally killed himself. I don't believe he killed himself. Am I wrong about that? Jack Kerouac. I have no idea. That's a part of getting older. Part of getting older is slowly passing by everyone's prime point in their life. All your artistic heroes. Oh my God, Alexander the Great was 25 when he conquered the world. That's the first one you pass. Then you pass all the other ones along the way, and you feel like a big underachiever. But sooner or later, you come to peace with the fact that you are the person you are, and you achieve the things you achieve, and that's just your lot in life. You're going to die eventually, and your achievements are going to fade into dust, and your genetic line is going to become merged and confused, and that's the reality of us as limited creatures in a fallen world. Only God remains after everything is said and done. In many ways, I thought that it's godlessness that is the reason why all of modernity's great artistic souls keep on killing themselves. They have some idea that they can earn their way into spirit, like from the force of their own artistic creation. They can earn their way towards meaning, having a meaningful life. But really, no one's life is ultimately meaningful. When our civilization goes through its next transformation, even the people who we now know as great will be obscure footnotes in history. Oh, wow. I mean, people won't remember the names of the people who wrote the folk songs or the stories that we now cherish. You could read Lord of the Rings, and maybe Gerald Tolkien will be as fictional a character as Homer is for us. Who knows? Right? The distance will make the distinction of greatness meaningless. Distance not only in time, but in culture. It will be like a different world. And it already seems like a different world, doesn't it? Owen Zaleski for $20 USA. Hello, Dave. On the topic of folk, I have written a song in ballad meter about Billy the Kid fighting Dracula in the Wild West. I incorporated Billy's connections to the Catholic faith, including Servant of God, Sister Belinda Segal. I wonder if having a blatantly Catholic imagery and themes would be too preachy, larpy, or simple. Well, I don't know. I think it's fine. I mean, having vampires appear in the Wild West is, I mean, it comes off as kind of it comes off as silly and jokey. And writing folk music about Billy the Kid fighting Dracula it's going to have to be, I mean, all folk music in America is a little bit silly. I'm just going to tell you this straight up. You just have to be aware of that. It's only LARPy if you're not aware of how silly it is, or if you can conceivably sell it as serious. You know, obviously, the great example of, I mean, you can kind of go both ways, right? Like a lot of the early folk songs that we know were joke songs. Take Me Out to the Ball Game was a joke song. The guy hated baseball. He wrote it as a parody of baseball fans, and it became an American classic, as folky as anything. Or conversely, Bob Dylan, who, you know, he portrayed himself as this folk artist, as Woody Guthrie, nothing of who he actually was. But yet, he kind of knew what he represented, and because of that, he faked it till he made it. And those are really the two paths for folk music you could have. So I think that, you know, it sounds fine. I'd have to actually hear it. Really, when it comes to folk music, the actual sound and its catchiness matter more than its subject matter. Unless you're really writing something like Bob Dylan, where you're writing poetry with a little bit of rhythmic structure. But thank you for the super chat. I hope it goes well. Novum for $10 USA. I wanted to thank you for your recommendation of Over the Garden Wall. My jaw dropped when I got to the final era. Even as Cal Arts cartoon, the depiction of the 1990s is uncanny. In a way so visceral, I've never felt it from an actual recording of that era. I can't place my finger on exactly why. Yeah, the Over the Garden Wall depiction of the 1990s is very, very accurate. I remember the 1990s being that way, and I do yearn for it. I yearn for sort of the in-person connections that are just open to any kind of speculation. I appreciate it in terms of people who actually have to create using real things like tape cassettes and notepads rather than using digital things like computers and blogs. The physicality of culture from the 90s is certainly a large part of it. Like Magic the Gathering cards were cards. Dungeons and Dragons were pads of paper and hex maps. And manual books that had dog ears on them and illustrations. The physicality of culture was a big thing back in the 90s. Yeah, but it's hard to know, though, what can be taken from that. What can be taken from folk culture? What can be taken from the 90s and turned into something that is as permanent a fixture in our lives as it was in our ancestors? Quick fun fact, the Sacred Harp music that I recommended on this stream, the second episode of Over the Garden Wall showcases that. That's what the music sounds like. Pottsfield. The music of Pottsfield is Sacred Harp. One of the most basic forms of American folk music. But again, thank you very much, Novum. I hope to recommend more stuff that you'll appreciate. It's always hard. Sometimes it's hard to know what really, like, I think a lot of people watch, like a few people watch Over the Garden Wall and were disappointed because they thought it was something like Shakespeare or Dostoevsky. It's a kid's show, guys. It's a family piece of entertainment. It's not Shakespeare. It's not War and Peace. It's not In Search of Time Lost. It's not William Butler Yeats here. Although it does allude to some of the stuff in the folk culture. And, I really hate Cal Arts, but that did get to me. TN 1000 for $10 USA. I've been trying to explain Conquest's third law of politics to people. I find that rewording all the people in charge of the bureaucracy turn on the bureaucracy itself in the end. There'd be a better way of putting it. How accurate is that? Well, I don't know how accurate it is. People have brought this to me many times, and it's like an open secret. Conquest's three laws of politics are not from like a book. They're not written down anywhere. They're just things that his friends used to say he talked about a lot. And so they're completely apocryphal. There's not a book called Conquest's Three Laws. So you can interpret them any way you want. For instance, the first law, everyone is conservative about that which he knows best. I always paraphrase as everyone's conservative about that which he loves best, because it makes more sense to me. The fundamental truth of the third law of conquest, the third law is, I think directly paraphrased, is that a bureaucracy eventually becomes a conspiracy against the organization itself. The way I like to paraphrase it is that management and leadership always becomes a conspiracy against the stakeholders. So in the case of the British government, the stakeholders are the British people. Parliament is supposed to represent the British people, the people themselves, the English people, the Scottish people and the Welsh people, I think, are the three groups it's actually supposed to represent, but very much the folk. And now what the British government is a giant conspiracy to subvert the interests of the people in the name of the oligarchs. Management has become a conspiracy against the stakeholders. And you can reimagine that or rephrase that in any way you like to illustrate your point, but that's the fundamental thing I believe that Conquest was trying to illustrate. The process by which the managers put in charge of an organization come to subvert the eventual spirit of that organization and represent instead their own oligarchical interests. That's what completes the set of three that explains most of the process of modern democratic political systems. Creeper Weirdo for $5 USA. I'm really uncomfortable with the conversation around AI art. It feels like people are giving up on creators of art. It's like they just want products to consume and not art to inspire. It's anti-human and uncomfortably cyberpunkish. Yeah, I hate cyberpunk art. Oh, sorry, I hate AI art. AI art is blasphemy against art itself. I can see using it as a starting template, but we really have to be careful now with how we consume art. Here's what I'm going to say. There's no future for art without us curating our limbic processing system. That is going to take a lot to unpack, but I hate the word limbic, but Alex Kashuda uses this word a lot with limbic capitalism or limbic modernity. What she's talking about is what I call the dopamine depression cycle. And certainly I struggle, like all social media users, with this very much in my own life. I'm speaking to you on social media right now, so I'm not doing you any favors. But as you know, being a modern person, you hit your dopamine receptors and your ability to process profundity in other context decreases because your brain is geared towards that constant dopamine hit. That's one of the main obstacles for video games being art. They're either bad video games or they're bad art because video games need to have a sort of dopamine latency that makes it very, very difficult for you to perceive art. That's the main problem with video games being art. But there's no pathway for art that doesn't go through us, curating what we intake. First of all, ditch things like pornography, which are just mind poison. But it also means not consuming so many, like extreme limited consumption of things like video games, or things that are like quick, like a lot of nerd hobbies. I'm very guilty of this too. Quick fixes of dopamine that constitute your entire experience of the thing. Listening to audiobooks as opposed to reading them. You should be reading actual physical books and not always listening to them on audiobook, because it slows down your brain. And the same thing is, it slows down your limbic modernity, your limbic reaction to constantly always want the dopamine hit. And the same thing is true for AI art. There is going to be no consumers of art in the future unless we slow our consumption of art down, which means that we have to pause and think deeply about fewer images than just constantly swiping, like through Instagram on images 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Because the AI algorithm is going to optimize for your limbic dopamine hits. But when you slow down, first of all, the AI nature of the art is going to become apparent. And B, you'll start asking questions like, what did the artist intend? And if there's no answer to that, because this is an AI recombination of other pieces of art, then immediately the art itself becomes meaningless for the way your brain is perceiving it in the mode of slow thinking. A really good nonfiction book, although again, this is very much a book that you can consolidate into an article, is called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. We need to perceive all art in the mode of thinking slow. And AI art's designed in the mode of thinking fast. It's designed for the Instagram brain. I don't know what to do with Instagram brain. I really don't. I have an Instagram account. I ogle miniatures being painted on it. And damn, is it addictive. It's picture Twitter. It's terrible. We have to curate this stuff. We have to stop ourselves from using this stuff so much. We have to have boundaries. But that's part of sort of the larger discussion that we have constantly. Dreadnought for $10 USA. Hey Dave, hope everything is going okay. I spent the workday listening to Martyr Maid's series on Epstein and have fully refilled my black pill reserves. Well, have you heard Martyr Maid's interview on Ukraine? You want another black pill? Martyr Maid, guys, is a great podcaster, great Substacker. Everyone, you can listen to his talk with Alex Kashuda if you want a brief introduction, but very much a heavy hitter in the distant sphere, both in quantity of content and quality of content. I highly recommend him. So he says, I finished his series on Epstein and my black pill reserves are refilled. So here's a little something for the family. Or whiskey. Whatever. We're all doomed. Just kidding, sort of. Infighting right-wingers tend towards disagreeableness. Guys, I'm really done fighting with the right-wingers. I'm really done complaining about it to you guys week after week. This is something we just need to get over. So, yeah, let's get over it. Perfect. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have to talk about discourse in some sense. And this is another problem we have with discourse in the political sphere is discourse has died. Discourse, like between 2015 and 2020, political discourse was crazy. It was the Wild West. People were actually changing their opinions. But now everything is locked in amber. The left has their audience. They have the majority of young people, and they don't want them going anywhere. And neither does the ruling class. And they algorithmically throttle us, and the left will never talk to us. So it seems that all conversations with leftists are futile, because no one's interested in that anymore. There's nothing to gain from them. And in the meantime, the distance can't get to an audience, can't get to the audiences that really need to hear them. But in the meanwhile, I guess we have to be arguing with each other on Twitter, but I'm not participating on it anymore. I'm not. I will post a tweet thread occasionally for people who want to read it, but I'm not discoursing on Twitter, ever. It's just not. Aaron McIntyre has set a good precedent. I'm just muting. Muting. Ben White with his weekly update. Ben White, Lonely Hearts Club banned. No luck with the girls again this week. The feeling when you have no trad cast GF who understands Italian elite theory. Here's $3 for your excellent content. I appreciate all that you do. Yeah, I'm really behind on my other Substack essays. Hopefully I have a fun little tidbit coming out soon, ahead of another long-promised stream. But I'm getting to it when I'm getting to it, especially now that work's picked up after vacation. But thank you very much, Ben White. Appreciate the super chat. Hopefully you have better luck finding your trad girlfriend. The problem as a married man, I feel very bad at giving advice about what's worked for me. But you need to have your priorities straight. Get a woman who's going to be your ally, who's open to that possibility. And adjust your expectations accordingly. There's a lot of good girls out there, but their access to relationships is being throttled intentionally, I believe, at this stage. Well, I don't know, maybe at this point the incompetence is so high, it's indistinguishable for an intentional destruction of our societies. Sam153, good evening, Dave. Good monologue as always. It always hits on the right spots of the zeitgeist. Happy Spooky Month and hope your family enjoys trick-or-treating. Yeah, so this year we didn't want to buy costumes, so we're just using an old one. So the oldie but goodie is I'm going as Mark Antony, my wife's going as Cleopatra, and my son is going as Augustus Caesar. So we bought like a mini toga for him with laurels, and we're going to have a good time. He can pretend to defeat me at the Battle of Actium. And, he has sort of an Augustus Caesar's type bowl cut as well. So it's really perfect. He really does the role. And I think this year he's really going to enjoy trick-or-treating for the first time. So I'm really looking forward to that. I hope that we don't come down with one of these interminable toddler colds during Halloween like we did last year. But thank you very much, Sam153. I'm going to continue going on, so I finish before midnight, hopefully. Cringe Walker, hey, how's it going, man? Long time. Cringe Walker, $5, USA. Hey, happy Halloween, and here's hoping all local friends can still manage a meetup in these whereabouts. I just got reimbursed $400 for my Belgium apartment heating. So maybe that Norway pipeline they just opened is working? What say, Eurobros? Well, I don't know. I feel like maybe the cathedral has got some backup energy system in their back pocket, and so things aren't going to be just disastrous in Europe this coming winter. Like, maybe that's going to be the case. But I don't know what it is. I don't know. Maybe we're all going to be made big fools of, and the global American empire is going to call in a few favors, make a few concessions, and there's just going to be containers of oil and natural gas that show up in supply ships pulling right into the North Sea and Italy, and it's all going to be fine, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but still fine. But that's not what my instinct is telling me. But we'll have to see. Like, we don't know what's going to happen in the election next week. We just don't know. Dreadnought for $5 USA. I think that the original Alien still holds up as a great horror movie. If you're looking for a good horror film, a good horror video game, Alien Isolation is a worthy companion. If you like suspense and the horror sort of thing. Yeah, horror video games can be pretty good, can't they? I don't really play them ever. I thought BioShock was kind of scary. I've heard good things about Alien Isolation. Alien still really holds up as a good horror movie. It really does hold up. I've seen that one a bunch of times. I can't, are there other good science fiction horror movies? I feel like there are. I always felt that 2001 Space Odyssey was kind of a horror movie of sorts. But it's, I don't know, it's still too classic science fiction. I'll probably think of something in a little bit. But given how these things go, maybe not. But thank you for the super chat, Dreadnought. And I'm going to keep on going. St. Peter. All right, St. Peter says, I, an apostle of Jesus Christ, am calling you to account for the hope that is in you. How would you make a defense of your religion to any unbeliever who in good faith would challenge you? Well, challenge me on what? Exactly, like a pagan? I mean, look, this is how I usually conceptualize the problem. The first issue is the existence of God and being comfortable with God. I don't think that you can argue for the veracity of the Gospels without a belief in God. And then after you believe in God in the most abstract sense, a belief in God that guides the human race in history. Then you have to start with people establishing that miracles are a reality. That physics is statistical in nature, and that statistics themselves cannot overrule the existence of extraordinary phenomena. Finally, you have to establish the existence of... There's a reason why so many people were taken in by Chesterton's The Everlasting Man and orthodoxy. And that is because I think a critical component is the direct belief that God himself is temporally interested in the human race and has manifested miracles in history to guide the human race in some form. That's what the Old Testament of the Bible describes. And the Old Testament is an essential backdrop for the Gospels. To start with the archaeology of Jesus' resurrection and then to go to the Old Testament seems to my mind to be backwards. Even though I do encourage people to read the Bible backwards, because in many ways it tells the story better. Or out of order, at least. But after that, and only after the belief in a God that is guiding the human race through miracles, can the examination of Christ's life, incarnation, and resurrection be approached earnestly. And I'm not the person to defend the archaeology of the resurrection. I'm just not that person. But for the arguments that I read back a decade ago when I converted, from the apologetics I've read, it was demonstrated to my satisfaction. And moreover than that, I religiously feel its veracity and how I approach the faith and how I believe I've seen God's actions and the form of the saints and the testament of the church, as fallen as it is in the present day. That's my elevator pitch of how I would approach my faith with atheists. I'm repeating the way I came to it, but that's how I came to it. And that's how I would present it to other people. Obviously, each one of those signposts is a whole huge conversation that I can't go into here in the super chat. But thank you very much, St. Peter, for all you've done. Although I wasn't expecting to see you super chat. PBK, $3. Gah, I super chatted Michael this week, and he said he already talked to you. He might have mixed you up with somebody else. Yeah, I'm pretty sure, unless I've really forgotten this, there was a period in 2018 where I was talking to so many people, and I was getting married, and I was defending my PhD. My entire life became a giant blur. And if you convinced me in 2018 that for a week I had smuggled drugs and was a narco for Mexican cartels, I might believe you because that entire summer was a huge blur. And I feel like I have gaps in my memory from it. But I'm still pretty sure, unless you can find me a record of talking to Michael Malice, that I've never talked to Michael Malice. But thank you, PBK. Maybe I'll look into it and offer. Here's somebody recommended I talk to Blonde in the Belly of the Beast, and I really do want to talk to her. I listen to her Matt and Blonde show all the time, and not just for her comically hyperbolic racism that is super funny. I should have her on, but really, before talking to people like internet podcasters, I really want to talk to Lambda and some of my priest friends about more religious topics. And so thank you very much. Dreadnought for $5 USA. Why is that not highlighting? Okay, let's try that again and again. Okay, interesting. Maybe I do want to pin this. Someone's recommending The Fly as a I don't know. Okay, I guess I'll just have to read this super chat, Dreadnought, because it's not for some reason. Oh, there we go. All right, here we go. Dreadnought for $5 USA. I don't think Washington cares about whether Ukraine wins. Just that Russia loses. Russian arms have already been shown up to be inferior, and if the Ukrainians can kill a few 100,000 Russians, Russia might be crippled for a generation. Yeah, what the global American empire and the State Department want to prove in Ukraine is that America can still fight a proxy war and win against another major power, and that they are the ally that you want in their corner. That's what they're there to prove, and they don't care that Ukraine wins, because Ukraine can't win, because Ukraine's entire population is going to be ethnically cleansed out of Ukraine by the end of this conflict, and an enormous number of their young men are going to be dead, and their young women are all going to be in foreign countries with very, very little incentive to move back to a devastated war zone. So Ukraine has lost the war. The only thing that the State Department wants to demonstrate is that they can fight a modern brush war and win, and that everyone should ignore the fiasco in Afghanistan and believe them when they tell you that they're still the big dog, they're still the big fish, and you want them in their corner. They want to be able to sell their embassies and sell their experts to foreign governments going on into the future, and they can't do that if they're big global losers. And this war is a war to demonstrate that they're not, or that Russia is a bigger global loser. Eventually, though, I think most countries will see this and think to themselves, if Ukraine is what it means to be a friend of the State Department, who needs enemies? Massa D'Amato for $3 Australian. People often describe governments as authoritarian, but aren't all governments by definition authoritarian? I hear smart people talk like this. Maybe I'm missing something. It seems redundant, no? Yeah, this is one of the misnomers of the 20th century. When people say authoritarian, they usually mean, well, first of all, there's two words. There's authoritarian and totalitarian. And totalitarian does have some meaning. Totalitarian governments are the kind of governments that right-wingers usually complain about, where the state seeks to absorb all cultural fixtures and make it part of its propaganda apparatus. And totalitarian states are really a function of mass media and the 20th century superstates and information control that was used in those states. And these are kind of societies that right-wingers generally don't like. Then there's this weird concept of authoritarian, which means one or two things. It means sort of just monarchy or any form of monarchy. But in the American context, it also seems to mean a certain lack of independence, a certain seeking of authority's approval, the way we would associate people behaving in European countries or Asian countries, where the citizen is not seen as an independent entity that's forging his own life, but rather as somebody who's a client to a larger state that sets the boundaries of what he can and cannot desire. The first definition of it just being anti-monarchy is probably more sensical, but really the second definition is really more what people mean. But it's this second definition that really relies on this concept of an independent polity that in the 21st century is very rapidly becoming mythological. The American people used to be an independent people, but does anyone believe that America is a free country in that sense after COVID? The bureaucrats just flick a switch and your churches turn off, your small businesses close down, and the entire debate over why or what parameters are used to govern this are just switched off. And it's believe the experts, believe the experts, believe the experts, trust the science, trust the plan, Fauci is a saint. If that isn't authoritarian in the classic American sense, what is? So at the end of the day, the only thing authoritarian can possibly mean, given that we're rapidly moving into the totalizing state, as Aaron McIntyre puts it, the only thing authoritarian could possibly mean is just monarchy. That's all it means, just monarchy. That's it. And to be quite clear, I'd prefer a monarchy as long as we could hold back the totalizing state, which it's obvious democracy does not hold back. All right, so Takar for $10. It's one of these things again. I've got to get rid of the questions tab so people don't put them there. Takar for $3 Australian. Do you think the relatively high wages of software engineering will continue in our lifetime? Thank you for your time and thoughts. Kind of. I think that wages for blue collar services like plumbers and carpenters and contractors will equalize with that of software developers. I don't think there'll be a large distinction. In all cases, I think the real name of the game will be to have some specific speciality that you can sell to people, like knowing all of the newest software doodads, or being an expert in a particular area of algorithms, or having a particular ability to make graphics programs, or anything like that. The distinction between a good programmer and a bad one is probably going to mean more than the distinction between a programmer and a plumber. As a matter of fact, the plumber might make slightly more. So I absolutely do think that coding jobs are going to equalize with the higher blue collar jobs. They probably, though, will forever be above sort of the lowest rung service level minimum wage jobs like coffee barista or gas station attendant and stuff like that. The skill-based jobs, they'll have to be higher than those jobs in terms of wages, just because you have to motivate people to get educations, and if they're not, then no one's going to do them, and people know that, and people still will need programmers. They still will. We are a long way away from an AI that can program itself. A very long, if that's even possible. We are a very long way away from it. And our current slowdown of technological development is not bringing that in any closer. So we will still need computer scientists. But thank you, Takar, for the super chat. I'm going to move on. Coming up on time here, so then please, I'll ask for a moratorium on super chats, please, for the remainder. Thoughts on women playing contact sports? Thoughts on women playing contact sports? It seems to me, at best, it's a waste of time. Really, though, I just find it utterly grotesque. but I can't articulate why exactly. Am I just a grumpy old man? Yeah, I think it is grotesque, to be honest. Massive amount. I'm usually a huge sports person. Like, I think sports. I mean, I'm not much of a sportsman myself at this stage of my life. I do appreciate tennis, and I did play tennis on the on high school team for 1 year in high school. Although I kind of sucked. It's all right. But I'm a big proponent of sports for men and women. I think it really turns you into a better person. But contact sports for women is it's a spectacle. And I know of no women wrestling, like women boxing is disgusting. Is absolutely disgusting because they're being objectified as sex objects by many of the fans while they're engaging in a supremely dangerous event that by its very nature defeminizes them and makes them into a type of warrior object that's really just not suited for their nature. Then there's stuff like women pro wrestling, which is like women play act fighting, and things like Powder Puff. Does anyone know Powder Puff? Powder Puff is this joke football game played in high school, usually ahead of the Sadie Hawkins dance, where the girls play football and the men cheerlead. It's like a joke thing. We did it in my high school, and it's always very silly because the girls don't really know how to tackle each other, and it's a big gag. I guess female contact sports are good if they're play acted, but I mean, what are the big female contact sports? Unless you're talking about like soccer. Like, is soccer a contact sport? Soccer is a great sport for women. Tennis is better, I think. Volleyball is even better. And I guess volleyball and tennis are even less contact than soccer is. But really, I draw the line on soccer. Soccer seems like a perfectly fine sport for women to play. But I don't know. I know of no actual, like, real contact sport that's not a joke that women play that's treated seriously enough that I'd have to actually engage with it. So yeah, that's my take for what it's worth. Cringe Walk for $10. While I was in Belgium, I found a lot of inspiration from the Flemish movement regarding our current problem. A big theme from Jan Baptiste Verlooy was, how do you get a high culture for your people if they define high culture as what they are not? For them, high culture could only be French. Well, that's funny, right? Because when you go to like the Louvre or any other big exhibition of European art, it's always dominated by Flemish artists, the great Flemish masters. And so I can't separate in my mind Flemish culture away from high culture. Maybe there's something to be said for that regionalist persuasion that I always gravitate towards in my own art. The kind of art that seeks to be anti-elitist in its inception. Of course it can't be, because all art is elitist by its definition. It is oligarchical by its definition. It is hierarchical by its nature. But there is something to be said for art that's geared towards the people, away from that which was previously considered high art, and that tries to break the formalism of high art. And that's yeah, I might. That's a good sentiment, although I don't really know how to react to it. Oh, he goes on. Cringe Walker says for $5. Verlooy identified 3 sacred spaces to capture and spend a generation creating a local high culture. Hearth, where the fathers teach their families their blood. Altar, where the priests teach fathers' faith. And stage, where the priests and father are taught their folk. Interesting concept. I think that if there was one, so obviously hearth is interesting because I'm not so sure how to create high culture of the hearth. Maybe you could say that high culture of the heart is resurrecting things like dinner parties or slow food or other cultural fixtures like that. So, but then moving on to the church, a huge open area of expansion for us is liturgical art of the type that Jonathan Pajot makes. Icons, church decorations. I would love it if we could have people ornately make books, missals for people, such that you could carry a missal into church and really felt like you were holding something that was special. You go into church these days, you flip open the missals, they're torn pages, they're folded over, they look ratty. And half the time they're horrible music like you have from the Gather collection. It's so funny, making fun of the Gather collection of Catholic hymns is so played out that the jokes about it are tired. People are making jokes of the jokes that they make about the Gather hymnal, but people still use it, or they use some equally uninspired thing, and the entire affair just feels really, really cheap. That's a huge area for artistic expansion, and there's no way that a piece of sacred art can't be special. If you make it and the believer values it, it is natural, it is instantly high art. No one can take that away from you. There's this horrible scene in an excellent Canadian movie from 2002 called The Barbarian Invasions about the death of this shit-lib professor who works in Montreal. And it's always close to my heart because my grandparents were at the same time dealing with the Montreal healthcare system at the end of their lives. And in it, one of the children who's visiting or their dying father, she's called away to examine. She's an art dealer, and a local priest asked her to appraise all of this unused religious iconography. And there's these Montreal Catholic churches have these hordes of this religious art that's just unused because everyone stopped going to church. And the character says, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's not worth anything as art. It's just worth what it meant to the people who came to church here. But there's a converse to that, and that is that for people who do go to church, any art will be instantly meaningful, even if it is cliche. Why do all of the art made for modern churches feel like it was created for boomers? Going to church at the same time where there was that big die-off of religious faith, why does none of the art that we use in churches actually feel like it was created by young people who value their church? Huge opportunity. And then the last thing, the stage, I do really believe music, in addition to music being a fundamental performative art, I think theater might be a good place to think. And I know theater is the bane of our political existences because theater kids, we're essentially being ruled by theater kids. And the dramatic arts are essentially what embodies the cathedral's perception in the world the most. It's impossible to get right-wing actors together. But I would really love to see a right-wing stage play being produced and acted out. I think it would be really amazing. There was a play about conservative Catholics of the First Things variety called Heroes of the Fourth Turning that came out about 5 or 6 years ago, covered by Rod Dreher. It was the last interesting thing Rod Dreher brought my attention to, I believe. And it was a playwright who was himself a conservative Catholic about conservatives, and it was really interesting. We need more things like that. Theater is dangerous because of how it is mixed with politics, and I'm not going to mince words here, how it's mixed with women. Theater mixed with women and politics is dangerous, but if proper safeguards are erected, it's a powerful way to communicate essential human emotions on a very, very low budget. So thank you, Cringe Walker. Those are very good suggestions. And, finally, I got to the last super chat of the night, I think. Owen Zelensky for $3 USA. Thanks for the advice, Dave. It was a real eye-opener. I am working on recording the song, and I will let you know when Billy the Kid versus Dracula is done and out. Thanks again and happy Halloween. Well, yeah, thank you. Just know your audience and be honest about what you're doing. It sounds like a good, some of the best folk music imaginable has started with silly themes, right? So thank you everyone for joining me for the podcast today. I think I'm right on the 3-hour mark. The poetry reading today is a reading from the book of Psalms, and I will read, I'm going to read Psalm number 4. A nice short one this time. Psalm 4. When I call, answer me, O God of justice. From anguish you released me. Have mercy and hear me. O men, how long will your hearts be closed? Will you love what is futile and seek what is false? It is the Lord who grants favors to those whom he loves. The Lord hears me when I call him. Fear him, do not sin. Ponder your bed and be still. Make justice your sacrifice and trust in the Lord. What can bring us happiness, many say? Lift up the light of your face to the Lord. You have put into my heart a greater joy than they will have from abundance of corn and new wine. I will lie down in peace, and sleep comes at once. For you alone, Lord, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. With that being said, guys, thank you for joining me for this broadcast from Fiddler's Green this week. I will see you next Tuesday after Halloween, and we'll talk further about the developments and the oncoming election and what it implies. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of the evening. Good night. God bless.